So it looks like those money-grabbing little rascals at EA have decided to give us a new Dead Space game. Well, a remake of the original if we're splitting hairs. And all I can say is, hooray, I guess? Dead Space first burst onto the scene back in 2008, and for all intents and purposes, it was a pretty cracking game. Clearly inspired by Resident Evil 4, it took the action horror genre into space and featured its very own brand of terrifying reanimated monsters for players to take on and run away from. It was received generally very well by the gaming press and quickly gained plenty of fans, thanks to the game itself being very entertaining to play, its story and lore being rather intriguing, and it having some of the best sound design ever featured in a horror game. And fortunately, fans didn't have to wait too long for a sequel either, with Dead Space 2 arriving on the scene some 2.5 years later. Dead Space 2 is, in my opinion, one of the greatest video game sequels of all time. It took everything that made the first game great and refined it, while also adding a sense of scale and spectacle far beyond anything seen in its predecessor. And personally, I think moving the needle a little more towards action actually worked really well, given how fantastically the game controls in third-person shooter terms. The story was also more engaging, the necromorphs became even more of a threat, and revisiting Dead Space's ISG Ishimura for a chapter was a frankly genius idea. It did also have an extremely pointless multiplayer mode for some reason, which was probably an indication of the way EA wanted the series to go in the future, but the less said about that, the better. Honestly, describing it as one of the greatest video game sequels of all time probably isn't enough. I also consider it to be one of the best horror games ever made as well. This is a sentiment many critics and gamers alike seemingly shared at the time of the game's release, and it was at this point that the Dead Space series looked to be at an all-time high. And then EA decided to get more involved in the franchise, and it all came tumbling down. Now, there is one thing you can't blame EA for, and that's how many copies Dead Space and Dead Space 2 sold. Neither performed as well as EA hoped they would, and this of course gave them cause for concern as they began to work on Dead Space 3. So they decided to get a little more involved in the creative process than they had in the past, and ultimately managed to ruin everything. Dead Space 3 should have been a home run for EA, simply continued to build on the success of Dead Space 2 using the same talented team at developer Visceral Games, perhaps switch up how the series was marketed a little, and Bob's your uncle. Except EA didn't really fancy doing that, did they? Instead, EA looked at how successful Resident Evil's cooperative approach to action had been and pushed for Dead Space to include similar, which by the way lacked a split-screen component for some bonkers reason. They were of the view microtransactions were the next big thing for squeezing more money out of their customers, and so asked for those to be added as well. And they even lobbied for the game to lean even more towards action than Dead Space 2 previously had. Dead Space 3 was meant to be a single-player story about protagonist Isaac Clarke's continued struggles, not just against the necromorphs, but against his own mind as well. But then EA got involved, and the Dead Space 3 which released ended up being an absolute mess. Visceral's vision for the title was clearly compromised by the money-hungry executives at EA, and what we were left with was the worst game in the series by a long, long way. And lest we forget, after Dead Space 3's release, EA very much decided to go with the "not me, governor" approach when accused of meddling with the franchise, something those working on the title would later dispute once their jobs were no longer on the line. And why were their jobs no longer on the line? Oh, that's right, because after meddling in Dead Space 3, EA decided to can the franchise and move Visceral Games onto a Star Wars project, which was then also promptly shelved. To put it in simple terms, EA not only ruined the Dead Space series, but then used its subsequent failure to massively screw over everyone at Visceral Games as well. Their treatment of the franchise was bad enough, but the way they treated the people who worked so hard to create the games was frankly appalling. And so we come to the Dead Space remake. Will it be any good? I don't know, it might be fantastic, it might not, we'll just have to wait and see. The Dead Space series is one I still think has a huge amount of potential, and I'd love it to experience a resurgence in popularity nearly a decade after it was treated so horrendously by EA. But there's one thing I want you all to remember, and it's this: EA deserves zero credit for bringing back the franchise in 2021. Their behaviour in the past was awful, and they showed little regard for the series when it was first in its heyday. They don't care about you, the fans who want to head back into the world of Dead Space. They don't really care about the franchise, or hold it in any higher regard than any other series they've managed to get their grubby little hands on. They don't care about the creative vision of the original Dead Space team, who have no say in what will be changed as part of this remake. No, what they care about is money, your money, and how they can move it from your pockets into their pockets as quickly as possible. They're not reviving Dead Space because they love the franchise and want to give it a second chance. They're reviving the franchise because they've seen how well Resident Evil has been doing in recent years, and they now want a slice of the action. Dead Space may be coming back, and it may even end up being new and improved, but in the end, it's still being published by the same old terrible EA. Thanks for taking the time to watch the video, boys, girls and engineers. If you enjoyed it, do consider letting me know your thoughts, as well as liking and subscribing, as it all really helps the channel, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon.